And thank you, Dimitri, as always, for your very gracious hosting. So as Paul mentioned, I'm Anya Schemann at American University, and pleased to be a non-resident senior fellow here at the center. And I'm joined today by two really excellent experts on Ukraine, and I'm just so pleased that you were able to find time to join me today. I originally conceived of this panel because my sense was that there was a lot of talking over the patient going on. And the patient, being Ukraine, is really in pretty dire condition. And oftentimes in Washington, we have these conversations about grand strategy and about U.S.-Russia relations and et cetera, without really focusing on the actual problem at hand. And everything that I've been reading about Ukraine, I'm not actually a Ukraine expert myself, but everything I have been reading and hearing and seeing has really alarmed me, and especially so in recent days when the situation there seems to be increasingly of concern. So I have asked these two gentlemen to join me here, and let me just briefly introduce them. Professor Keith Darden is a colleague of mine at American University School of International Service, formerly of Yale University, and is an expert on nationalism, state building, and politics. He's also a co-editor of the Cambridge University Press book series, Problems of International Politics, and is very actively engaged in a number of fora in this town, and has been a commentator on Ukrainian and Russian issues. Keith has really emerged as a fresh and kind of unexpected voice on some of these issues, and I actually can guarantee you today that you will be hearing some things here that are not commonly said in a lot of the policy circles in town, so I think that will be quite interesting, so thanks for joining us. And then Dmitry Gorenberg, who is a senior research scientist with CNA Corporation's Strategic Studies Division, an expert on security issues, on military affairs, ethnic politics as well. He is an editor of the journal Problems of Post-Communism in Russian Politics and Law, and is also an associate at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And we're glad that you are in town and able to join us, so thank you. Dmitry, let me start with you. If you could give us a sense of the current situation in eastern Ukraine. There's been a ceasefire supposedly in effect since late September. It seems to be violated almost daily, although in general it seems to be somewhat holding. There are reports that Putin has pulled back Russian troops from border positions, probably to set the stage for his meetings in Europe this week as a goodwill gesture. I've heard various reports about that pullback, so I'm wondering if you've heard if it actually is taking place. And so if you could give us a sense, and then we hear about also struggles in Donetsk, particularly at the airport. Give us a sense of the actual military situation on the ground and who has the upper hand at this point.
Sure. Well, I think I don't know. As far as the last thing, I don't know who has the upper hand. I think there's no way to know unless the ceasefire was actually violated to the extent that it ceased to function. I think what's going on. Can people hear okay? Should I speak more into the mic? So I think what's going on right now is that there are a few places where the separatist forces, I guess we can call them as shorthand, are not happy with their current positions, and that's where the ceasefire is being violated to the largest extent. So Donetsk Airport is one area. Debaltseve is kind of a salient that's kind of cuts into the separatist held territory that's still controlled by Ukrainian forces, and that's another area. The significance of Debaltseve is it's kind of a transport hub as far as rail links and roads and that sort of thing. So that's why the separatists are eager to take it back. There were some earlier on in the post-ceasefire period. There were some sort of movements around Mariupol, and there was concern that there would still be an effort to try to take Mariupol. That seems to have died down by and large. So those are the main areas where the ceasefire is being violated. In terms of the troop pullback, I think it's. I'm sure there's a political component, as you said, with the meetings, but I think it's also goes beyond that. Troops are expensive to maintain in the field, and the demobilization, the next round of demobilization of conscripts is going to start soon. So there were other reasons to pull back at least the covering troops. Now our best understanding is that the troops that were actually involved in fighting in the region in August were not conscripts, but were more kind of elite forces. But there were always kind of support troops and that sort of thing, and those would need to be returned to base so they can start rotating in those troops out and bring in new conscripts. There's that kind of reasoning that I think plays at least as much of a role as the political factors. Now, my main expertise is in the Russian military as opposed to the Ukrainian, so I'm not as I'm not exactly I'm not as confident as far as my knowledge of what the Ukrainian military has been doing in the month as far as trying to reconstitute itself after some pretty serious defeats in late August. I would imagine that they are trying to sort of rebuild some of the. Well, they don't necessarily have much equipment, but at least get some new people in. But it's easy. It's always easier to defend than to attack, and that was part of their problem. Is that in August there was kind of an overstretch, and they were in a lot of different, thinly spread in a lot of different positions, and that was part of the reason why they were defeated so quickly and comprehensively. Now that they've kind of formed a line and can defend a fairly a more of an obvious boundary. And also, since the Russian troops aren't involved, they could probably hold their own against whatever forces the separatists would bring to bear initially. So maybe I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm.
We can.
Thank you. Yeah. So this has been a 6-month conflict at this point. Almost 3,500 dead. Poroshenko has just replaced his Minister of Defense, who has just been confirmed. A popular, by all accounts, general. So obviously in Ukraine they're hoping to somewhat turn the tide. But on the Russian side, although Russia denies direct involvement in the eastern Ukraine uprising, there have been reports of Russian soldiers, Russian-speaking soldiers, ethnic Russian soldiers. And in recent days, there are some reports that many of them have been leaving. And I wonder what you can say about that. Does that mean that there have been some? Are they responding to some order from Moscow, or is this just sort of an organic departure? Or what does that movement? Could that mean?
I think that there's maybe a perception in Moscow and probably in Donetsk and Luhansk as well that this is sort of trending towards a more of a stable ceasefire, with the possibilities of kind of a frozen conflict kind of scenario, in which case you don't need as many active soldiers involved. So, to the extent that that's what's going on, I think that may be more of the scenario rather than any kind of political calculation. We'll probably get to the political side later, but I don't see a lot of hope for a resolution. But
okay, yeah. Thank you. I think we're all still getting tornado warnings. That's what those beeps are. But I will let you know if it really does get worse, because I'm keeping an eye on it. So I want to talk a little bit later about U.S. and European policy, but just for the moment right now, we have recent meeting between Lavrov and Kerry. Putin will be meeting with Poroshenko this week and with European leaders. What is your perspective in terms of hopes for a resolution of some sort, a more secure ceasefire, a further withdrawal of forces? Is this a possibility, or are you more negative?
Well, I think anything's a possibility, but I don't think it's very likely. Mm-hmm. For a number of reasons. And we can, to start with, I think Poroshenko, in the prelude to elections coming up, has to worry about his right flank, so to speak, right? And so appearing to give away too much would be problematic from just a political, internal politics standpoint. For the separatists, they, I think, there's some combination of some people who um, still have sort of dreams of greater control or even territorial expansion of the people's republics, or maybe even declaring independence, so forth and so forth. But the greater problem is that there's a lack of unity among the various separatist groups, and I think we shouldn't overstate the amount of control from Moscow. I think clearly there's Moscow influence, but I also don't think that it's so simple as to say, oh, these people are all just taking orders, and will do whatever Moscow says. It'll be, I think, even if there was a reasonable ceasefire proposal to get, both Donetsk and Luhansk and all the key players within each of those to agree on something, would be difficult without Putin asserting a lot more control than he's been willing to do so far on over the separatists. So I think that's why, I mean, just for internal, we can get to the larger U.S.-Russia dynamics, but the internal dynamics are themselves not very amenable to a solution. That doesn't mean that I think we're going to get back into conflict. I think this kind of temporary ceasefire that turns permanent may well suit both sides well enough, and so that I think is probably where we're heading for at least the next few months.
Okay, a final military question before I turn to the political and economic situation. Is it Putin's goal to create a land bridge to Crimea?
No, I don't. I think that it was a possible goal very early, maybe like I'm talking about like in April or so, when there were uprisings in different regions. So Odessa was unstable, when there were, there was really the possibility that a lot of regions could follow what at the time was a Donetsk-Luhansk scenario, which was not civil war yet, but just taking over administrative buildings and taking control of political institutions, such as they were in various regions. But when those forces were largely defeated outside of Luhansk and Donetsk, then I think the calculus was to just limit. It was too much. If there was a goal of a land bridge, let's say in August, when there were Russian troops involved, it would have looked very different. There wouldn't have been 6,000 troops. It would have been tens of thousands of troops in Ukraine, Russian troops, right? And you would have seen other troops coming from Crimea as well. We didn't really see. I mean, there was some mobilization, but there were no real indications of that. So I think that for Putin, the goal is more to keep Ukraine unstable and, at least to some extent, politically beholden to Russia, rather than to try to hive off more territory. And even a fairly small part of 2 oblasts is sufficient for that goal.
Okay, thank you, Dmitry. So on that note of instability and political goals, the semi-ceasefire in the East has allowed Ukrainians in the world to focus a bit more of their attention on the various ills at home. And the ills, as I mentioned at the outset, are numerous. A floundering economy in Ukraine, a collapsing currency, galloping inflation, a gas crisis. And then on the political scene, we're heading toward parliamentary elections coming up on October 26th. And there has been some unrest in recent days in Kiev as those elections approach. So just at the outset, Keith, focus first on the politics. What can we expect from these parliamentary elections? What might the outcome be?
There have been several surveys that have been done that all have Poroshenko's bloc leading in the parliamentary elections. But the percentage by which they lead, I mean, it's going to, maybe they'll pull in 25 to 35% of the seats. So they'll still need others to govern with them. And on the whole, the next ranked party is Oleg Lashko, the Radical Party, which is more or less a populist party, a right-wing populist party. Lashko himself has been involved in illegally detaining prisoners and perhaps leading to their deaths. It's not a typical normal party with a programmatic agenda other than renewing fighting in the East. So that would be a difficult party to govern with. But Poroshenko's been quite careful in constructing his own bloc to incorporate some of the more moderate, potentially less corrupt elements in the Party of Regions, as well as some of the new Maidan figures, particularly journalists from Ukrainska Pravda. And so I think he's trying to bridge within his own bloc some of the divisions that exist within Ukraine, and those also allow him to form alliances with other parties that will allow him to govern. Yatsenyuk has also formed his own party in an effort to keep his seat as prime minister. He needs to show that he can pull in some votes as well. And they have incorporated some of the similar elements as Lashko's party. They brought in a lot of the volunteer battalion commanders into the military wing of their party. In many respects, it keeps the fusion of the far right and social activism of the Maidan and formulates it into a party organization with all of the problems and dangers associated with that. But it's very likely that we aren't going to have big surprises in this election. I think there will be relatively low participation in the South and in what's left of the East, but still possibly 40 to 50% turnout, or maybe even higher. So the elections will largely be seen as legitimate. But the problem is that other than Poroshenko and Tihipko and some of the other old political figures, there has not been a concerted effort to incorporate the pro-Russian sentiments that pervade in about half of the country, even the half of the country that remains. And so where that electorate falls, whether they feel they're incorporated into the new government or not, is going to be a big question going forward, even after this parliamentary election. The hope was going to be that the parliamentary election would renew the legitimacy of the government, just as people, including myself, had hoped that the presidential elections would renew the legitimacy of the government. Did that to a certain extent, but the surveys that we see from IFES, for example, show that people in the East don't think that parliamentary elections are going to be free and fair. They don't think that the government is currently representing the interests of the country as a whole. And it's not clear that a new round of voting with parties that don't appeal to the electorate in the South and the East are going to change that outcome. In particular, because the way in which the campaigning has been done has been patently biased in some respects. It's dangerous to be a former Party of Regions candidate trying to compete in this election. We've all seen the videos of the trash can challenge of parliamentarians running for office being beaten and being thrown in trash cans. It's not something that we would consider to be part of normal healthy election campaigning. There's a lot, even in the surveys, for example, there's a very high percentage of the population that says they don't know who they would support. And that might just be the uncertainty of the time, but also I think it reflects a certain degree of fear of response. That even under Yanukovych, you had very low percentages of the population saying don't know. I think now there's a bit of a worry when someone comes to your door and asks you questions about separatism, asks you questions about who you're going to vote for, particularly in a context in which separatism itself and expressions of separatist sentiment are a crime. So these are going to be strange elections. Big parts of the electorate are not incorporated, but I do think what they will yield is going to be a fairly pliable Rada for Poroshenko, and that we can expect to see some major reforms pushed through in the immediate aftermath of these elections, while there's still some sort of halo of legitimacy associated with them.
Thank you. I've really been struck by those trash can attacks, the so-called dumpster lustrations, which does seem to be a sign of really sort of a lack of control from the center. But two quick questions on the elections. So will the eastern regions participate, or are they going to boycott in some areas? And two, can the nationalist right-wing forces be contained?
So the eastern regions will participate, other than the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Obviously, there's not going to be elections in those areas. And in what remains of Donetsk and Luhansk, the elections that take place there will be incomplete, almost certainly. The surveys suggest that a large percent of the population is not intending to vote. And that could skew the election in odd ways, right? So that as long as there is a single polling place in an electoral district, the results of that district are considered valid. And so even if there are only a handful of polling places that are set up in Donetsk and Luhansk, perhaps strategically placed in areas with pro-government supporters, you're going to get elected representatives from those areas in the single-member districts. And so that allows for a fair amount of manipulation in the upcoming election. But I think they will be held there. Perhaps they shouldn't be held there, but they are being held there, and you'll get representatives from those districts. You won't be getting them from some of the single-member districts, particularly the ones that are currently in Crimea and the DNR and the LNR. And your second question was?
The right wing.
Oh, the right wing. Well, the right wing's incorporated in all sorts of ways. The right wing is part of the current government and has been since the spring. Andrei Parubi is considered a right-wing figure. He's running as a member of the Yatsenyuk list. A lot of the right wing that ended up moving from the Maidan into the volunteer battalions is now in the Yatsenyuk list. So they're sort of being accommodated in a way that's not, some people would say that they're preparing for another non-electoral change of power, and that by allying with forces currently within the government, they set that up for a future date, keeping themselves in politics, so that it's not clear who's co-opting whom in these circumstances. The actual far-right parties, the individual far-right parties, are not going to do well, except for Lyashko, right? So it's not clear that that's a far-right party. It's sort of a fringe populist party. But Svoboda is not going to break 5%. Samopomosh is kind of a far-right party. They might break 5%. But on the whole, far-right parties are not going to do well as parties. But they have been assimilated and incorporated into the major parties, except for Poroshenko's party. I think that's an interesting... You see the splits within the government when you look at who's on whose party list in these parliamentary elections. And so I think we're seeing a much more moderate Poroshenko who's making a play for votes in the south and the east and might be successful in doing so. And if that party does particularly well, then it might keep the far right at bay. But they're brought in so many different parties, both formally and informally, and in certain wings of the government like the Security Council, that the far right is there to stay until the government falls.
Now on the economic front. Apparently, Poroshenko and Putin are ready to hammer out some sort of gas deal in the next couple days, although it probably won't be, entirely satisfactory to either side. Ukrainians are looking toward a pretty cold winter, and it's making a lot of them nervous. But if Ukraine's economy continues in this downward spiral, who will come to the aid? I mean, IMF, World Bank ready to help out? Will the United States or Europe bail out Ukraine? Probably not, right? So what's the outlook for Ukraine's economy?
No one can bail out Ukraine. Ukraine is too poor, it's too insolvent, and the political will is not there. So they should not expect that the West is going to be paying their gas bills.
The political will's not there on our side.
On our side. And even if it were there, that would be a very costly bill to pay. This is not a small country. It was 46 million. It's somewhere around 40 million now. They have never reformed their energy consumption. They've relied for the past 20 years on low energy prices and skimming off of energy from Russia to support the wealth, the private wealth of the elite. That hasn't changed. There were arguments that it was going to change in the immediate aftermath of the sort of the February Revolution, that Yatsenyuk was the suicidal prime minister who was going to implement all these radical reforms and then be thrown out of power. He's holding onto his seat very tightly. He's not implementing any significant reforms. And Ukraine, if it doesn't reform, is going to be an insolvent hole for wealth for a long time. And no one wants to throw more good money after bad. And so they're going to have to reform. Or they're going to face bankruptcy, potential further fragmentation of the country. And so I think it will be the most critical moment for the survival of the country economically and politically in this month after the parliamentary elections. When there is a pro-presidential, we're very likely going to see a pro-presidential majority in parliament. There will be the conditions for passing some major reforms. If those reforms do not signal both domestically and internationally that the country is cleaning up its act and facing the hard reality of an actual budget, not these old, still Soviet-style, soft budget constraints where you're going to have cheap inputs and sell your outputs for a profit internationally, then the country's just not going to be helped by anyone. So that's it. The stakes are very high. It's not clear that the government is prepared to take radical steps for reform that would be necessary. And so it could be a very, very tough winter. Now, Russia doesn't want Ukraine to collapse fully, so I think we'll see some pliability in the negotiations. In other words, if Ukraine isn't able to afford Russian gas, Russia can't very easily sell its gas to Europe either, because they'll siphon it out of the lines, they'll do all sorts of subversive things. So there's an incentive to make some kind of a deal, just to keep that European market open. And Russia doesn't necessarily want Ukraine to fail completely for a variety of reasons, but they also don't have an investment in this government succeeding. And this government hasn't given them a reason to be invested in them. And so Ukraine's in a very difficult position of having to make changes that, even in the best of circumstances would be difficult. They're not getting any foreign investment. The hryvnia's falling. And they've got to do it all soon. What odds do you give Ukraine weathering the storm? Not the storm, but their storm. Their storm, 35%. And by not weathering it, I mean the government falling and potentially the country splitting further. So that's 60, 65% over the next 2 years. So for the winter, we'll see. There's still, Ukraine's a society that's dealt without having an effective central government for a very long time. If you drive around rural Ukraine, you see roads that haven't been touched in 20 years. And so the absence of funding from the center may not be felt as acutely, but the absence of warmth and the absence of heating is going to be a difficult thing. My sense and my hope is that they will muddle through, but we'll see. Dima, quickly to you, and then we'll open it up to questions. Keith has outlined a pretty gloomy picture and has given Ukraine pretty poor odds for surviving the next couple months. Do you agree? And if so, what does that mean for the region and for Russia?
Yeah, I guess I don't know nearly as much about Ukrainian domestic politics as Keith, so I would defer to him on that front. As far as, I think the security situation is actually more stable now and will remain relatively stable for the next few months. After that, who knows? But I don't think that the Ukrainian government is going to launch a counteroffensive, for example, in the winter. And I don't really see the separatists trying to expand beyond this, these couple of little flashpoints that I mentioned that I think are going to be continue to be contested, but I don't think those are enough to relaunch a big conflict. But if to the larger question, if Keith's scenario, 65% scenario is right, and Ukraine does splinter in some way, I think it really will create some tough choices for both Europe and Russia, right? Because I'm not sure that it's in Russia's interest to have an unstable sort of collapsed state the size of Ukraine right on its border. So it may lead to sort of lead everyone kicking and screaming into that this discussion of how to create a new European security infrastructure that maybe we should have had in the early 90s but didn't. It's going to be a much more difficult discussion because nobody's going to have the starting points are now very far apart, and it's hard to see what the agreement would be. But it's the sort of we saw this once before when Yugoslavia was collapsing, where everyone kind of grudgingly came together enough to create some kind of stabilizing environment or force or some of each. And you could see that, although this would be a much more difficult problem, I think, because it's a much bigger country, and therefore, it's the kinds of forces that could be deployed in Bosnia are nowhere near enough to create a peacekeeping force for all of Ukraine, if that's what it comes down to it. I'm not sure it will, but if it does, I think it would be very difficult.
And should the U.S. provide additional military assistance to Ukraine?
You mean in the current, like right now, as things are? I don't think they would do much. It would do much good. It seems to me that a lot of the Ukrainian, we didn't really get into this too much, but a lot of the Ukrainian military's problems have to do with corruption and misuse of resources they already have, and so we could be in the last thing the U.S. needs is to provide more military assistance to yet another government that uses it improperly or loses it to some separatist force, or we've seen enough of that in the Middle East. So, given that right now there is a ceasefire, and that any serious military assistance from the U.S. would be, I think, interpreted by the Ukrainian government as a green light to become more aggressive, which I am not sure is in the U.S. interest, because what Russia has at least showed us in August is that they are willing, they are not willing to allow the separatists to be defeated. So unless we want Ukraine-Russia conflict part 2, I would just hold off and try to come up with some kind of stabilize the ceasefire as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. Well, plenty to reflect on here. We'll take some questions. If you could just let us know who you are, and keep your questions on the short side. Yes.
Hi, Keith, in your 65% scenario, I'm sorry, thank you, of Ukraine splitting further and the government falling, if you could go into detail, what does that look like exactly? Which parts, if you have something in mind, and if the government of Poroshenko, Yatsenyuk, how does it fall? What happens next, basically? Thanks.
So the 65% scenario was an and/or scenario. So it could either be that the government falls or the country splits further. It isn't necessarily both. And I think it's far more likely that the government will fall than that the country will split further. But one scenario is that we see a further escalation of the right-wing mobilization in Kiev. You have tires being burned outside Poroshenko's house. You have, significant moves on the parliament. The defense minister, before he was forced to resign, also had a mobilization outside of his personal residence. That you have an effort at forcing the current government out of power. And so that could be successful, or it could spark a counter-reaction of coercive forces that, it's less than a year ago that Yanukovych was in power. And, this is a country where the people who were in the security forces are largely still in the security forces. And they aren't going to be terribly happy about a takeover of the government by a further right-wing group, or a destabilization of the country by a further by a right-wing group. So you could have either of these coercive, once the possibility of an extra legal change in power is put on the table, as it was put on the table in February, the probability of it happening again is very high. This is shown in a variety of different cases. For coups, revolutions, the possibility of repeat is extremely high. And so I think in Ukraine's case, it's sort of ripe for that, particularly if you're not paying your military forces, which they're not currently doing, or that a lot of the resources that would be going to troops are being pocketed by the upper-level officers. So you have very disgruntled low-level officers who have been doing the fighting in the field. This is classic coup recipe. And so that might also, a change in power might lead to further calls for secession, right? Like we don't want any part of what's going on in Kiev. Kharkiv, if you look at the survey data, is not that different from the Donbass anymore. In terms, about half the population thinks the current government's not legitimate and not representing their interests. So they're probably the next one to go, in my view. And so it's not hard to see the fissures that were already there and have been there largely since the 19th century in this country, right? It's a fairly recent artifact made up of some very divided pieces. It's very easy to break along those lines when you don't have a legitimate government in Kiev, and it's hard to have a legitimate government in Kiev when they're not paying their people, when it's deeply corrupt, and there's a lot of people out there who know how to use weapons and are willing to use them.
And if the country splits, does it split along the old east-west line, so a bit more of eastern Ukraine, or?
I think it splits along Novorossiya. I think that, and that's partly potentially the Russian strategy about not pursuing the further moves in the east now, is that the conditions for doing so may appear more favorable in the not-so-distant future.
Corey.
Thanks. Corey, George Washington University. Two questions. One, on the economic side, there had been a lot of discussion as to the wisdom of postponing implementation of certain aspects of the association agreement. I'm curious if you think that this is a red herring, or if you think it really matters whether they drive forward with implementing the agreement or not, in light of what you're saying about Ukraine's economic conditions and their need to reform. And Dmitry, can I ask two questions? Something you had said, I wanted to clarify, that you had indicated that there are a lot of disparate groups in the Donbass, and it would be hard to get all of them to agree to a ceasefire. But the way you depicted it sounded, and correct me if I'm wrong, sounded like you were suggesting a scenario in which Moscow has interest in a ceasefire and locals don't. Can you say a little bit more about what the goals of local leaders are in the Donbass? Because it would seem that there are power-sharing agreements, or there are solutions that involve them staying inside of Ukraine that would be acceptable to them. And I wonder if you think that's the case or not.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think the local leaders have maybe a range of goals. There's maybe the primary goal is staying in power in one way or another. Now, one might say, well, they can stay in local power with a power-sharing agreement with Kiev, as you were suggesting. But I'm not sure that would require some level of trust. I think, right? That in or else outside guarantors, right? That Kiev wouldn't just toss him out, as soon as it became a little stronger. I think there's still some sort of more ideologically minded groups or individuals that are still entertain hopes of being annexed by Russia. I don't know how widespread that sentiment is. Russian leaders have certainly gone to some lengths to try to make it clear that they are not interested, but that doesn't mean that everyone who wants that is out. And you know, one thing that we know from history of all kinds of separatist type, you know, conflicts is that the locals sometimes, don't, their interests often don't coincide with whatever assisting central government is on the other side of the border, and that they often can use local situations to sort of force the central government to at least follow their desired goals to some extent because of larger considerations and sort of creating fates accompli and that sort of thing. So I think there's still some people who entertain some hope of that. I don't think it's the dominant perspective, but it's there.
Association agreement.
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate of free trade, but I don't think free trade is going to solve Ukraine's problems. Right? These are, and in many ways, I think it was stated as if the agreement was put off because of Russian pressure and the sort of red herring about Russia being concerned about the re-export of European goods into the Russian customs space. Russia's worried about the same thing that the Ukrainians are worried about, which is that they're going to be completely outcompeted by high-quality European goods, that once those tariff barriers are removed, their industries are just going to be wiped out. I mean, why would you buy Poroshenko's chocolate when you could get Belgian chocolate? And once those tariffs are removed, the domestic products will be considerably less competitive. Now, the collapse of the hryvnia helps that somewhat, but that was the real concern, is that, you're going to... So the European borders have been opened, right, or the barriers have been removed. So it's a free trade, it's a one-way free trade arrangement. Coming in the other direction, it could have long-term benefits of forcing Ukrainian companies to be competitive, but in the short term, it's going to drive a significant number of Ukrainian businesses out of business. And to the extent that those people are Poroshenko and people associated with Poroshenko, it's not terribly surprising that this aspect of the agreement was put off for some transition period. And it wouldn't surprise me. It's a good deal for Ukraine. They get free access to European markets, and the Europeans don't get free access to Ukrainian markets. So it's not surprising to me. But that's not solving. The full implementation of that agreement would not solve Ukraine's problems. Their problems are governance problems. They're internal problems. And that will put them over the long haul in a better position to get foreign investment, to create competitive firms. But right now, property is not secure in Ukraine. No one's going to invest. And trade, opening up the borders to trade is not going to solve that.
Sam.
Sam Cherub, double S. Just one comment on this last score. It is true that in the DCFTA there are adjustment periods for most of the Ukraine's lowering of tariff barriers, and what perhaps might be more relevant in this context is that also the institutional and structural reforms that the DCFTA really represents in terms of regulatory structures and so on have also been postponed. So there's a question about reform in the absence of that external anchor. Basically, 80% of the acquis communautaire implementation has been put off too, along with the lowering of barriers, which wouldn't have been immediately lowered anyway under the agreement because there were adjustment periods. But my questions were about two for Keith and one for Dima, and thank you both for your very interesting presentations. Keith, I wonder if the situation you're describing after the new parliamentary elections doesn't remarkably remind us of the vertical власти next door, in that once Poroshenko has control over all of the major branches of the executive, he might be able to actually get something done. And whether we're setting ourselves up here to be, and I understand that you could also do more reform in that context with less opposition within the executive branch, but it also creates the opportunity for arbitrary and suboptimal decisions and potentially over the long term monopolization of power, as we've seen with the other vertical власти that was constructed. And so whether that's something we really should be wishing for, at least as a long-term scenario. Second, about IDPs and the role in the election. Presumably we're talking about at least 20% of the population of the two conflict oblasts and their participation one way or the other, how it might affect things. Dima, this is sort of a follow-up to Corey's question. I wonder if your analysis would be affected by, I think you're focusing on decision makers and capitals, right? In terms of your mild optimism over the short to medium term. And as has been demonstrated over the summer several times, most notably with the MH17 tragedy, people on the ground do things in these kinds of contexts that can change the trajectory of these conflicts, regardless of what decision makers and capitals might or might not like. So how, under the new circumstances that are emerging with the implementation of, or pseudo-implementation of these two agreements, are the factors that could lead to, spectacular but unintended escalatory moments being reduced somehow, or are we still going to have this sort of potential for volatility latent on the ground?
You raise a very good point, which is that you can consolidate power, and the history of the effect of consolidating power in this region has never been positive. So, it has increased stability, as it did in the Russian case, but it has not led to greater reforms that would increase the market competitiveness of your industries in areas other than extraction. So I think you're absolutely right, that's a risk in the Ukrainian case. I think where it may turn out better this time is that Ukraine is facing a survival threat. So that the country really is at risk both externally and internally of losing its existence. And so there has to be some kind of response from the government. So you have to tackle corruption because the internal opposition to the government will be great if you don't. You have to reform your state apparatus because you've been shown to be completely militarily ineffective against a very insignificantly sized force fighting on your own territory. So there's the, Charles Tilly has these classic arguments about war leading to more effective state building. I think there's a kernel of truth in that. And so Ukraine, there are strong incentives there to do something differently. The status quo is going to be hard for them to maintain. Plus, the status quo was historically subsidized by Russia. And Russia is not going to continue to subsidize that status quo.
And IDPs is part of the calculus?
Yeah, the IDPs, the lion's share of the IDPs fled to Russia, so 2/3 to 3/4. I doubt they're going to be playing a role in this election. The others, those who fled to areas within Ukraine, will probably, I don't know what the rules are for their voting outside of their districts, but my guess is that they just won't vote. They have too many other things going on. I think it would be a very low turnout for those people, and I don't know what accommodations have been made for them even to vote, since they can't get access to their current polling stations.
Yeah, that's kind of on the local escalation. That's kind of what I was getting at with the locals have different incentives sometimes than Moscow does. I think that the chances for something spectacular, as you put it, are lower just because spectacular things kind of require some of the heavy weapons that were coming from Russia, and to the extent so that Russia has a little more control over that. Certainly, if the separatists decided they needed more territory, they could try something. Obviously this is speculation because I haven't talked to them, but my sense is that they recognize from past experiences that without Russian support, they're not going to get too far, and that sort of discourages them from going, attacking Mariupol, for example. So to the extent that Lavrov wants to make up with Kerry or whatever we're seeing now, and to the extent that Russia is not interested in escalation, and I think at this point, as things are right now, they're not. They're not going to make it easy for the separatists to go on the offensive. So, which leads me back to my initial point that the fighting they have the resources to fight in limited areas where they have particular strategic objectives that can be such as the airport and a couple other places. But beyond that, they're not going to try a new big effort to expand their territory.
You also think a Ukrainian offensive is not likely, right?
Impossible.
Impossible. Yes.
I'm Julia Gardinas from the National Intelligence Council, and I just wanted to follow up on your point with regard to Poroshenko and the Rada that we expect will be elected on the 26th, and ask whether you think that whether Poroshenko will be in a stronger domestic position to offer some concessions to the separatists and or to Moscow, after the Rada elections, and if things are kind of in a ceasefire holding pattern, at present, just kind of waiting for the Rada elections, and on the other side of them, what can we expect? Just curious whether the kind of Poroshenko-dominated Rada would have greater expectations for him if he's truly has incorporated the kind of right-wingers within his party. What kind of latitude will he have going forward?
Could I maybe add a question to that, because it flows very naturally?
Please.
Could the process of trying to negotiate an agreement actually be the catalyst of the process of breaking apart the government, Keith, that you were talking about?
Very good questions. I think that Poroshenko will be in a better position to make concessions and be accommodating. If you look at the platform of the bloc Petro Poroshenko, one is greater respect for Russian as a language, not as a state language, but presumably as a regional language. And so, they pulled that from the Party of Regions platform, and that's clearly of concern to both Russia and to the south and east of Ukraine. They also haven't really incorporated the right into their own bloc. In other words, the far-right elements in the current government are part of the Yatsenyuk party, right? And so he has been able to be the party of peace, as opposed to Batkivshina, Yulia Tymoshenko's bloc, and Yatsenyuk and Leshko, which are the parties of war. And so if he does well in this election, he has an electoral mandate to be representing a more peaceful settlement for this outcome. And another thing that we see in the polling data is that a significant percentage of the population of Ukraine thinks that the conflict is going to be resolved by further negotiation with Russia, and actually further negotiation with the DNR and the LNR, right? This is not held by any percentage of the population in the West and in the center, but it's still a strong majority view in Ukraine that negotiation is going to have a political settlement rather than a military end to this conflict. And so I do think that he's already made significant concessions. It will be interesting to see whether there are further territorial concessions, for example. It would be nice to end the fighting around the Donetsk airport, and I'm not sure how important it is for the Ukrainian government to hold the Donetsk airport if they're not holding Donetsk. So, that would be a natural area where we could see an end to the fighting, and just a recognition de facto. And that also deals with the question that you raised about the land bridge to Crimea. That's going to be a problem going forward. If you have a non-cooperative relationship with Kiev, and you have a territorially isolated population and military in Crimea, it creates the incentives to have a land bridge. Whereas if you have a cooperative relationship with Kiev, where they say, we're going to supply water, you're going to supply us gas at a slight discount, it's perfectly conceivable in the best case scenario that a relationship with Russia could improve following these elections. But that's still not solving Ukraine's internal governance and economic problems, right? So that's the backdrop to the more pessimistic scenario that I have. But I do agree with you that would be a mandate for potential change. And this gets at the issue. I don't think those negotiations would necessarily split the government, but they might. And I have a feeling that's what the Azov battalion, the Dnipro battalion, that's why they want in, which is they see themselves as a check on, traitor, Poroshenko, right? And if he starts making territorial concessions, then you might see full-scale mobilization in Kiev. So those are the areas to watch, right? So how accommodating can Poroshenko be without reactivating the Maidan? And that's his balancing act. But he's a good balancer, So I actually think there's some prospect for success.
Sorry, we're going down here first. Yes.
Yeah, Doug Zach, I'm vice chairman of this place. Let me lay out a premise, and then I'll ask you a question. The premise is that countries don't necessarily reform when they get clobbered in wars. Let me give you a few examples. 19th century, Paraguay takes on Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, loses 2/3 of its country. It's as corrupt as ever 150 years later. Russia gets clobbered by the Japanese in 1905. The Tsar doesn't change very much at all, brings in Stolypin, and you know the rest of that one. Iraq, after we beat them up in 1991, Saddam doesn't change. Egypt and Syria, the Israelis bombed the hell out of them in 1967. They don't change. There are very few countries that do. Japan and Germany are really what were behind all this, and that's because they were flattened and we helped build them up. If you don't have a country that pours billions and sends its troops in and writes their constitutions, you have an issue. So that's the premise. Given that, I don't believe anything is going to make Ukraine change in the short term. I agree with you entirely. The question is this: if they go through a terrible winter, won't there be even more sentiment to at least deal with the corridor that Putin needs and essentially drop into his lap? And we have historical cases where people really want to merge with somebody else. So will this winter, which you predict is going to be really rough for them, and which I don't challenge at all, change the balance to the point where Putin doesn't have to do much militarily?
Yeah, that's what I was suggesting with the favorable conditions in the not too distant future for Russia with respect to the acquisition of more territory. But there are costs with holding territory that Russia may not want to incur, and so if they can have a reliable cooperative relationship that allows them functionally to supply Crimea, and holding the prospect of, even if Ukraine does reach 5% of GDP in military spending by 2020, as they claim, which is not going to happen, there's still not going to be a match for the Russian military in the next 20 years. So that's not going to be relevant to the land bridge. The land bridge option to take through force will always be available. And so I think Russia would prefer not to do that. But you're right that the conditions may be such that those populations are willing to, the secessionist sentiment may shift so that those populations demand it. The surveys say that that's not so likely with Dnipropetrovsk, right? That you really have to get down into the fine grains of political. Yeah, maybe. But that is a likely scenario to split Ukraine fully, right? So that the country cleaves very strongly on what is the appropriate relationship with Russia. It cleaves very strongly on what is the appropriate relationship with NATO. And so if the economic crisis leads that to be salient and political choices become very, very clear between Russia and the West, that's the scenario in which Ukraine just splits.
Just to add one thing, maybe looking at it a slightly different way. I don't disagree with anything that either of you just said, but I'm not sure that Russia wants any part of Ukraine because it's expensive to to the extent, we think of Ukraine as a potential black hole for our money, right? We're not necessarily, Europe and the U.S. Are not in the best economic shape, but we still have a lot more money that we could spend on this if we wanted to than Russia does. Russia's much better off with a more pliant Ukraine than with having to pay for, rebuilding, Dnipropetrovsk or any of the not to mention Donetsk. There's a reason why they don't want to annex Donetsk and Lugansk, because then they have to pay for it. So much better to keep it on as this kind of in suspended animation and have international aid agencies or whoever pay for it.
Can I just quick come back? Right now, Crimea is isolated. Getting to Crimea costs money too. So, is there some way where it would be cost effective because they have to reach Crimea?
No, I think it's costs. It would. I can't see any kind of annexation scenario that doesn't cost a lot more than that cost. The cheapest way is, as Keith said, to have a more pliant relationship where you can supply by land through Ukraine, right? As they've been supplying Kaliningrad for decades now through Lithuania without too much trouble.
Or to write out Kiev and have a Bosnia-style confederation where you have a Novorossiya playing the role of Republika Srpska. And that was what Russia was calling for from a very early stage, and that may be the end game.
Yeah, that's. I just don't think that I may have not quite interpreted your point properly, but the land, that sort of land bridge concept implies to me something more formal than just some unrecognized state.
Bill Hill from the National War College, and let me just a couple of questions, but one remark. The Russians are in the process of solving the land bridge problem by building a bridge across the Kerch Straits, which is not very long. They've already shown the ability to build a bridge with the bridge to nowhere near Vladivostok for the APEC summit. Even knowing Russian construction, they may well get that done, in which case they've already got a ferry working there. All in all, given the costs already associated with incorporating Crimea into Russia, this is a far more cost-effective solution than taking a whole lot of Ukrainian territory and deploying Russian soldiers that are needed on the border in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. The first question about the elections. Listening to the polls and the speculation about the next Duma, to what extent are the stuff you're looking at, the figures you're looking at, taking into account the fact that it's a half and half election? The poll figures are largely for party lists, but there are 225 single mandate districts which are not necessarily reflected, or the likely outcomes not necessarily reflected in the party list. And do you have any data on it, or is that in the data that you're citing? Because this could be a particular ringer in terms of what kind of lineup it gives in the parliament. The other question is something. I have a pretty long background in negotiating in frozen conflicts, and so does Poroshenko. For that matter, he's from Transnistria, and he basically was one of the prime authors of he was born in Odessa but grew up in Transnistria, and he was one of the primary negotiators for Yushchenko, of the Yushchenko plan for Moldova Transnistria in 2005, which didn't work out well for the Ukrainians, or for the Moldovans, that matter. As I look at what I know of what I've been able to see of the status law, the interesting thing is that what he's granted is temporary concession, 3 years, and then it ends, and then they're back in a unitary Ukraine with powers to be determined, because Poroshenko has seen both what has happened in Georgia and what has happened in Moldova in both the relationship with Russia and the internal political dynamics, which I would toss out. I think you're maybe minimizing the differences or the difficulties with reconciling a nationalist right wing once hostilities have started. This is something that I have seen, negotiators in both Georgia and Moldova experience, where once having fought, substantial portions of the body politic are far more reluctant to accept concessions to either the big power next door that has been sponsoring or seen to sponsor the intervention, or those who have been fighting against the state. So I toss that out just for your response.
Well, Russia has experience with frozen conflicts as well, of course. So elections and frozen conflicts, and then a quick note on the bridge.
Okay, so this the single mandate districts, those were designed to support, basically bolster the position of the president, right? So this is why they were initially brought in, and Poroshenko did not change this system. That could have been changed before this election. So I think he is of the mind that he will be able to use those to make, sort of side deals with lots of the delegates from those districts. They are also associated with parties often, even though they're not on the ballot. It's sort of known who your allies. I mean, his son's in one of them in Vinica and things like that, so they're knowing. But I agree that's going to bolster him, and potentially bolster Yatsenyuk as well, because a lot of the concessions could come from the prime minister position if he retains that position. But they tend to favor the party in power. So that will further, put cards in his hand, and that could be a source of greater stability now. Unless what you say about the far right is true, no one has ever accused me of being overly optimistic about the ability to accommodate the far right.
It's not just the far right.
Yeah, those who fought.
It's that the center
Combatants.
mobilized too.
Yes. That once blood has been shed, it's harder to make these concessions. It could be done, but I agree that it's going to be difficult. And part of this sort of 3-year limit was a way of saying we're not giving up on the vision of a united Ukraine, but let's give this 3 years to sort itself out, and we'll come back to it then. I don't think it's going to improve in 3 years' time. And so I've pretty much accepted that those areas are not going to be part of a centralized Ukrainian government. But it might be the case that the Ukrainian government does more towards decentralization than they have put out at this point in that 3-year period. And that's part of Poroshenko's calculus as well. A lot will depend on the relationship with Russia. So you have Russia on the one side and the separatists on that side, and you have the far right and the combatants and a significant portion of the Ukrainian population that feels like they've made sacrifices to keep this country together. And so that it's not clear how that's going to balance out. Because if you don't make concessions at all, you're never getting those territories back except through military force, which is not likely to be successful. If you make too many concessions, you're going to have your government potentially overthrown by a disgruntled population that sees you as making traitorous concessions. So this is it's very hard to predict how that balance plays out 3 years from now.
So back to Crimea.
Yeah, I just want to introduce a note of caution on the bridge.
Oh yeah, the bridge.
Because so about 10 years ago or so, there was a joint Ukrainian-Russian commission looking into building a bridge, and they determined at least 10 years ago it was technically impossible to build a bridge because of the soils in the area, the winds that come through the strait, and it's one thing to build a bridge to some island near Vladivostok, but this is a big the strait it's a big span, right? And so the engineer, separate from the whole question of corruption and all the usual things that in Russia at least result in things being built just costing 10 times as much as they should. In this case, it may actually be technically very difficult, if not impossible, to build it. So it could happen, but I wouldn't expect it anytime soon.
I'd add that it's also strategically very vulnerable. So it's terrorism or sabotage. It's very vulnerable.
And the ferry. Sorry, and you know the ferry is subject to the same. Just in the last couple of weeks, there was reporting in Russia that the ferry was suspended because of high winds. So that's another issue there.
I would like to follow up on what Dmitry just said about the breach, about the ferry. I think you made a number of profound observations, both of you, but I particularly would like to address this question to Dmitry. Is because it really deals, what you said, with Russian predicament. Yes, it would be very expensive and very controversial for them to take over eastern Ukraine. And I would kind of think that Putin would like to find a way out of it, with sanctions playing a role, declining oil prices playing an even greater role. The Chinese are not willing to extend credits, a lot of love for Russia, but not much money. So I can see an incentive for Putin to display flexibility. But I also think you said that the Russians are kind of demonstrated in August that they would not allow the Ukrainian military to prevail. And if you think about political losses for Putin inside Russia, it would be very difficult for him to do it without a major compensation. If he was offered new partnership with the United States, if all sanctions were lifted, I could imagine this kind of a grand bargain, except I cannot imagine that he would be offered that. So let me ask you a question. We do not know, obviously, how they make decisions in Moscow. Clearly, there is only one decision maker, but there are a lot of different players. And we are getting more and more evidence that there is a school of thought in the Russian government and in Russian politics. And let's mention one person in particular as perhaps most influential in that school, Vice Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin, who is saying that Russia is not going to get any kind of a deal, that negotiation with Poroshenko is a non-starter, that the status quo is unsustainable, that it would be difficult even to control the Crimea for reasons you have just mentioned, and there is a growing internal tension inside the Crimea itself. So the term Rogozin and others are using is an arrangement through обострение, through accelerating tension. So what would happen if the Ukrainian government or some military formations in Ukraine would give Putin a good excuse to revisit the possibility of a military action? What if this time, as Rogozin suggests, they would not pretend that they are not fighting, but they would go all the way, as Rogozin put it, American style in the Balkans, clearly using the Air Force too. How would a confrontation like that between Russia and Ukraine look like? What is a potential for the Ukrainian military to stop the Russian advance anywhere in Ukraine, actually?
It would look bad, right?
So a couple of things to think about. One on the decision maker side. I don't think Rogozin is very influential. He talks a lot and makes a lot of grandiose statements that the media reacts to, and that is his role. He's not one of the inner circle, as far as I can tell. It's not that long ago, in 10 years, that he was one of the leaders of Rodina, which in a way went against Putin at the time, right? And I see his role as being that he's been co-opted in order to kind of trim his wings a bit and prevent him from making excessively extreme statements, populist kind of statements from outside the government. So I wouldn't give too much credence to that. But let's take that. So that's sort of one side. But let's assume that the scenario you played out.
Before you continue, I think you're absolutely right. except in Russia, as Emperor Paul has observed many, many years ago, there is only one person who matters except the emperor, he said. The person, he said, who is talking to me, and as long as he's talking to me. So not to overstate the importance of Rogozin, there is clearly a school of thought. And even if Rogozin is not very influential, the school of thought, I think, is there.
Yeah, but I think those the people who are in the inner circle don't subscribe. I mean, that's kind of what I was alluding to. Don't subscribe to that school. But regardless, let's assume that one way or another this scenario comes to pass. I think the Ukrainian, if Russia was serious and committed sufficient forces to do what you laid out, I don't think the Ukrainian military would have much of a chance to stop it for any. I mean, it could delay. There might be some delaying tactics if they were smart, but it wouldn't. When Putin said in 2 days we could be in Kiev or something along those lines, he wasn't exaggerating that much, right? It may take a week or two, but yeah. The question is what happens afterwards, right? The cost is not in the invasion; the cost is in holding the territory. Both the economic cost and the within the economic cost, there's the internal economic cost of maintaining that territory, and the external economic cost of, because then you really would probably end up with the extreme sanctions that nobody really has wanted to implement so far, right? So now we in this scenario, it I would guess that they would have factored that in and would have already discounted that or in a sense been willing to pay that price. But nonetheless, that's sort of another countervailing factor. But then there's the cost of the various Azov battalion types conducting some kind of partisan kind of insurgency in the territory that would lead to a lot of casualties. And we already saw in a very brief, just a couple of weeks in August, the one thing so far that has made any dent in the popularity of this whole campaign within Russia was the casualties. And they were not that high, given the type of conflict and the scope of conflict. So if you started seeing, you would need a fairly large occupying force. And if those people were being attacked and dying, right, you could see a lot of unhappiness in Russia. It's another, again, still do it. If they want to pay the cost, they could do it. I just don't think it's very likely.
Do you have a comment?
I think it's not unlikely, and I don't think it's just Rogozin, it's Glaziev, it's Shoigu. I mean, this is a big view in Moscow. I agree with you completely. You hear talk of from friends in Moscow that they've just given up on the idea of Ukraine, right? That they don't want to deal with Kiev, and so that it really is that sort of Bosnia viewpoint of we're going to carve out the pieces that we care about, and it's not just a land bridge to Crimea in those scenarios. It's taking significant pieces of the country in the south and the east, and so I think that Ukraine has always been in a weak bargaining position. There's nothing they can do militarily to defend themselves. They should be able to. They're a major arms exporter. It's a huge population. It's their own territory, but they didn't spend the last 25 years very wisely. And Sam and I wrote a piece, back in the spring, saying, you could accept the federalization deal now without blood, or you, after paying all the expensive costs of fighting and dying and the polarization that will result from all of that, you're going to be left with a Bosnia-style federation later. And I think that's still a significant possibility.
Let me make one very brief comment about it. I think that, first of all, I obviously agree with you, Keith, but I also agree with Dmitry. It is very difficult for Russia and in many respects totally unreasonable and out of character for Putin to do what Rogozin at least seems to want him to do. Putin is not a Napoleon. We're talking, however, about a country without good options. It is in that environment that we're discussing possible Russian choice.
So, I think we're not actually there isn't as much disagreement here as it may seem, because what I was reacting to was there's a Russian invasion scenario, which I do think is unlikely, versus what you're describing as something that results from really internal collapse leading to some kind of federalization. That doesn't require a Russian invasion.
It
that
may.
comes from inside. It could.
But they are titrating their involvement. That's the thing, that they thought they could do it with a little bit of help, and it became clear that the little bit of help that was being provided informally was not enough, so that they sent actual Russian units to do the fighting.
But they stopped.
But then they stopped. But I don't think that this is the end point that is desired. I just think that the conditions in their mind would be more favorable a few months from now, for exactly the reasons that we discussed post bad winter.
I don't disagree, but I don't think it should. I don't think it needs to be done. I think if the options are to do it through military force or not do it at all, then the choice would be to not do it at all. If the choice are to that it could be done through an internal disintegration, where Russians might well be welcomed in much of the in certain parts of the country as a stabilizing peacekeeping force at that point, right? And then you could do it without the crippling sanctions, and with much lower costs and with more support from the population. I think
they have been concentrating forces in Crimea too, which suggests that that's happening for a reason.
It could be just defending.
Do we have any last questions? Yes.
Just David Johnson from Sterling. The kind of questions that have been asked seem as though there's kind of and maybe I'm hearing something that's not been said, almost a binary solution: either things become stable or the Russian Federation forces march on Kyiv. But isn't the most likely outcome that this just becomes a king-size version of Moldova, with all the joys and tribulations that brings?
As we're approaching our ending hour, are there any last questions we can just throw in? No. So if we can just move to some concluding thoughts here. Let's take this question on about Moldova. But just referring to this last conversation that you had, the two of you, with Dmitry, we were talking about the view from Moscow, but how does that look from Washington? You mentioned that Russia might come to the point where they write off Kiev and just decide they just don't want to deal with it anymore, take what they can and move on. That sounds like a scenario that would not be in Washington's interest or desire. So Moldova, and then let's move to U.S. policy, and then we'll finish.
Okay. I actually think the view from Washington is this view that, it's going to end up like Moldova, that it'll be contained to its current boundaries, that it's a manageable problem, and that, the status quo is going to sustain itself. I don't think that's likely, because Transnistria was a clearly defined space. It was previously, it was the part of Moldova that was in the Soviet Union in the interwar period. It wasn't entirely Slavic, but it was something like 2/3 Slavic, and they were very pro-Soviet in their orientation. It was easy to do, and you had the 14th Army there as well, right? So it was a contained, the other side of the river. There's nothing like that in Ukraine. In other words, there's no natural limit to the areas that would be desirable, let's say, or seen as important to be part of that failed rump mini-state. And so that's, if you really believe that the sole ambition, both of the forces that are currently in Donetsk and Luhansk and in Moscow, is to carve out a tiny tail in the Donbass that will keep Ukraine out of NATO, then it's going to be contained to this. I just don't think that's the case. I think Russia cares more about Ukraine. I hear people talking about, well, it took us, a decade or two to incorporate them the last time, and, we just have a long-term plan. We're going to incorporate parts of them again. So I think that the Shoigu, Glaziev, Rogozin, I think that view is too prominent to settle for this. And I think it's just there's going to be a period of crisis when the conditions are created so that you don't actually have to do a full-scale invasion, but that the further incremental taking of territory is likely. I don't see how this is an equilibrium point.
A couple of things. First of all, this is just a minor thing, but Shoigu and Rogozin are like serious rivals, right? We shouldn't group them in the
Sometimes
same.
people that occupy the same ideological space can be rivals.
I don't think they do. I think that they are both ideological. I think Shoigu, I wouldn't ascribe the Rogozin-Glaziev points of view to Shoigu. He's much more, and this is a guy that's been in Russian government as a minister since the early 90s, the only one, right? He is, a chameleon in a way, right? Like his points of view shift depending on who his patron are, and his patron is Putin here, right? Not these other guys. But anyway, that's sort of a side note. The other thing that I want to caution on is the idea of a plan. I don't think there was a plan. I don't think there is a plan now in Russia on what to do. I think there are preferences for controlling much, if not all, of the former Soviet territory. Controlling does not mean annexing or incorporating. It means having influence in and having, whatever economic ties and political ties, making sure that nobody opposes what Russia wants to do. I think there's some belief that Poroshenko may be somebody that can be dealt with, and it would be much less costly to deal rather than now. If it turns out that Poroshenko, adopts the Batkivshchina or the Lyashko platform, and in a few months, and starts acting very differently, then it could all change. And then finally, just on the question of the population, I think of what the Russians have called Novorossiya, but the southeast. I think that there's a reason why all those uprisings failed back in April in those regions, which is that the level of support for pro-Russian positions there is much lower than in Donetsk and Luhansk, right? And it has been consistently throughout, and I don't think that anything that has happened in the last few months has increased pro-Russian attitudes in those areas. If anything, it's decreased them. Now, it could be that after a hard winter, that things are so hopeless that they see no choice. But it's not that's different. First of all, that's different from a pro-Russia mentality. And second, I see, we talked about, I'm not sure why it's necessarily going to be a hard winter if the gas deal gets made, which Poroshenko is really working on, right? So, it would be a hard winter, but no different from the last 20 hard winters where just because the country is relatively poor and things are not reformed, rather than because there's no gas and we're all freezing. So I'm, I don't know if that's not optimistic, but it's maybe less pessimistic than Keith.
All right. Well, I've certainly been enlightened by this conversation. I hope you've all gained some insights, and I hope our tornado has passed and that you're all able to exit the building safely.